But then, how did it get to the point last summer-ish going into the fall of 2020 where Dylan McCaffrey or, Jim Harbaugh said, hey, Joe Milton's the guy. And then Dylan McCaffrey was basically out at that point. It was really how was Jim so sure? Because Dylan McCaffrey had shown – it's not like he hadn't shown that he could be a solid quarterback, because I think that what we said on the podcast was, all right, what this shows to me, if Jim Harbaugh is saying, yes, Joe Milton's the guy, I'm 100% confident, and Dylan McCaffrey is going to transfer, that means that Joe Milton must be unbelievable, right? And it turns out that wasn't the case. So tell me what happened last summer that showed Jim Harbaugh that Joe Milton was the guy and that Dylan McCaffrey couldn't get it done. I think that's what's frustrating to everybody is how they're managing these position battles. They're either doing too much with too many people, or they're giving it to one guy and saying, all right, you're it, and everyone else is out of the race. So it's just this interesting thing where Jim Harbaugh, I would think, loves the position battles. He's a guy, he's a fighter. His whole time as a quarterback and at Michigan in the NFL, even in as a coach, he's a guy who just loves to fight and will never back down to anybody, right? That's been his whole mantra, his whole career. Well, why is he not? He should be able to spur these position battles and have these guys fighting so hard and not giving up and things like that. But it just doesn't seem to translate to those. So that's where I struggle. And like you said, we don't have any vision on what's going on behind the scenes in these position battles, because not many people do. No, not many people are inside Schembechler or in the big house watching these practices. But I just don't understand why you go to a lot of these other schools such as Ohio State, Alabama, even just in general, a lot of other Big Ten schools too, and they have great position battles and they turn out that both guys can contribute, or the guy that ends up being as the runner-up to that position and the backup, he still is contributing and still working hard to get there. And that's not what seems to happen at Michigan in a lot of these cases.
Let me ask you this question, Justin, is when you look at, let's just take Penn State, because James Franklin gets, beaten down by Michigan fans as someone who's completely inept and unqualified and is nowhere near the coach that Jim Harbaugh is. And certainly I don't love his in-game management, but he's been at Penn State for 1 year more than Jim Harbaugh. And when you look at the three positions, quarterback, running back, and wide receiver, and ask the skill that they've brought in, do you think that he has gotten the most out of, or at least more consistently has gotten the most out of his talent than Michigan has? And you can talk about KJ Hamler and the success that he had at Penn State, Trace McSorley, who wasn't really a highly recruited player, but was a great quarterback for Penn State. Look at the running back position. You got Saquon Barkley, Miles Sanders, who's now the starting running back for the Philadelphia Eagles and who had a 1,000-yard season for James Franklin. Journey Brown, who was well on his way until getting injured for Penn State. And you look at some of the other wide receivers, the Mike Gesicki, the tight end, the Freiermuth, the tight end. You look at their skill positions, and when they've got talent, you can argue that Penn State has not lived up to its own potential, but they're getting the most out of their skill position players far more consistently than Michigan is. And yet this is a James Franklin who everybody thinks is a rambling bum that can't compete with a guy like Jim Harbaugh.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, Trace McSorley is probably the greatest quarterback in Penn State history in terms of his career. I mean, there's an argument for that. At least he put up unbelievable records. And he was a guy, like you said, you definitely got the most out of him. There was nothing left that you could get out of him. And so I think when you're talking about getting a lot out of a little, I mean, Jim Harbaugh has gotten a little out of a lot. Let's be honest. I think there are so many cases where it's 4- and 5-star guys that turn out to be not so great. And so that's where I agree with you. I think James Franklin, maybe he hasn't, it hasn't certainly translated into wins all the time, but he does have a Big Ten title, and you can call it a fluke because they blocked the kick. But as It's one more Big Ten title than Michigan has, unfortunately. So I agree with you. I think James Franklin has definitely gotten more out of his guys, especially at the skill positions. Micah Parsons is going to be a top draft pick. Saquon, like you said, Miles Sanders. You can run down the list. Sean Clifford is a guy who shouldn't be doing. He shouldn't, in my opinion, just looking at him doesn't look like a starting quarterback in the Big Ten, and he produced really well. So I think in terms of developing their guys, they've got a leg up on Michigan for sure.
Well, it's all, again, if you're listening to this podcast and you're like, damn, Spats and Rowe are just way too cynical, and I just, it's just too much. I get it. Like, I'll acknowledge, but this is 6 years of disappointment that is kind of rearing its head. When I'll give you since you brought the relationship earlier, Justin, I dated a girl before my amazing, awesome wife, who I used to fight with a little bit, and we went to couples counseling, and we learned this thing about like the Four Horsemen, and it was like and it was this whole idea of like, when you start having a negative experience with someone, ultimately what you'll do is, even during like the positives, you'll find like the negative in it, and it just sort of builds on the top of each other. Like, it's the avalanche coming down the mountain. Since you're a big skier, you can understand this reference, that you just can't get out of the way of, and it just keeps on building on each other. And so instead of focusing in on any of the positives, and we try, there's some parts of this coaching staff, we mentioned Ron Bellamy and Mike Hart on previous podcasts that I'm really excited about. I even like Mo Linguist and what he can bring to the defense. There's certain things that are good, but when you've had 6 years of disappointment, and 6 years of heartbreak, and 6 years of getting punched in the face and the whole thing, you just go to this, you see the negatives much stronger. And it's going to take, for me as a fan, not as a fan of Michigan, but as someone who is very anti-Jim Harbaugh, it's going to take something special in 2021 for me to get back on board. And that's not going to happen with recruiting. That's not going to happen with spring practice. That is only going to happen if they go out there and they win football games at a rate that they have not won football games under Jim Harbaugh so far. And until that happens, I am going to be critical, and I'm going to be cynical of Jim Harbaugh, because all we have are 6 years, 4 years of utter disappointment from this program, and 0-5 against Ohio State and 0-6 in the Big Ten.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, it's tough. I think we've seen it happen too often, where the hype is there and then it's disappointment. So I think, we'll revisit this conversation about 100 times, I'm sure, before next season. But I think there's a lot to be excited about too, with some new faces in there. So we'll do a breakdown of each one of those new faces in terms of what they can bring to Michigan here in the future as we ramp up towards next football season. And also, Mike, we got Michigan basketball coming back hopefully soon. So hopefully we can be less cynical and more on the optimistic side for that.